If you're not applying a basic communist organizational model, you are going to be wasting energy on every single one of the tasks of the revolution that you put yourself forward to. Even these so-called communist parties and the mass orgs they lead are all based on this kind of huge fear for leadership, for any kind of organizational structure or discipline. It cannot be described how paralyzing this is for making any kind of action.
The following is an interview with Karl, chair of the Communist Youth of Denmark, or the DKU. They're a Danish MLM organization dedicated to the proletarian cause and working to build a vanguard party in Denmark, which is a long and arduous path. In the interview with Karl, we discuss a wide array of topics, from the history of the DKU specifically, including their efforts to oppose revisionism and unite around MLM, as well as their efforts to Bolshevize their ranks. We also get into the history of the communist movement in Denmark, as well as the current state of the working class movement there. We also discuss the situation in Greenland and the machinations of the US and Danish ruling classes in their efforts to grab and maintain control, respectively, of Greenland. And this topic is particularly relevant given the imperialist conflict, which is only intensifying globally, not only between the US and its rivals like Russia and China, but even between the US bourgeoisie and their allies like Denmark. If you're interested in supporting the channel, please remember to like and subscribe to this video, and check out the link in the description of the video for our Patreon. All right, I'm very glad to be joined today by Karl from the DKU, the Danish Communist Youth. Karl, can you introduce yourself?
Hello, comrades. I'm Karl. I've been with the DKU for 4 years. The DKU is a revolutionary Maoist youth organization in Denmark who is aimed towards building the Communist Party and rebuilding the revolutionary movement in Denmark.
Yeah, we're really glad to have you here and excited to educate the viewers of Marxism today about the movement in Denmark and the efforts to build up a Maoist party there. So can you just start by giving us a little bit of background of the DKU, how you all got started, how you became an MLM organization, and so on?
Well, it's a long story, but even though it's just been about 4 years, we initially started as a joint youth organization of two of the big revisionist parties in Denmark. We basically started out looking to make a youth organization because there wasn't one currently, and because we were a group of young people who were getting interested in communism because of the developments internationally and in Denmark, and we saw that the left as it was had been failing. And so we had a basic consciousness of the need of rebuilding a different kind of resistance, but we weren't clear necessarily in the beginning on the need to make a new party. What happened was that we initially had a little bit of a childish strategy of trying to make all the parties unite, because we had maybe a good impulse of not just seeking to split and go their own way without having a good reason to it. But through the long-term interactions with a lot of these parties, and we saw that it was not just personal splits, it was not just stuff like that that made the parties fail and made them have such a big decline, lose the influence in the Danish working class movement, but also to be split. There was actual political content to these splits. And I think that one thing that, as a positive aspect, that guided us the whole way through was the basic assumption and approach that the previous communist movement had made some serious mistakes that had led it to fall back from where it was. And we needed to identify those mistakes and build our movement on that. So initially we were just moving through some very basic things like reclaiming being able to just say that you're a communist, and we're not afraid of talking about what happened in the Soviet Union under Stalin because it's scary, or we are serious about reading theory, and we're serious about approaching these things. These things were all things that we had to fight for in the beginning, because there really just wasn't any kind of movement in the Danish left that accepted these things anymore. It was seen as trite and old school. Basically, throughout the first years, we quickly realized that this approach of trying to unite all the parties was not going to happen. And through that, we realized that it was more necessary that we needed to build our own independent political line and start actually analyzing our history and analyzing the Danish society. But because of the basis we had been built on, it could be no other way, because there was no communists to get us started. We had a very broad basis. We just united about being communists, maybe Marxist-Leninists. And we also had a very loose organization, because we had people in all the different parties. We had double membership. We allowed people to be in all the parties because of what our strategy originally was. And this ended up making a very split and disunited organization. And that's why the first major struggle that we had, upon realizing that we had to do the very long and hard work ourselves of rebuilding the communist movement, was the fight to have an organization based on democratic centralism. Because in the very petty bourgeois influenced leftist environment, that was not in any way a culture that had been passed on.
And can I ask, just In terms of democratic centralism, you mentioned the left opposition to this petty bourgeois activist scene. What were some of the lines opposing DC? And then how did you all unite around democratic centralism?
Well, a trend tendency that's been all around dominating in the Danish left, and I believe also in many places in the other countries too, since basically the last 50 years, has been a very big tendency of flat and rotating structures and having these very anarchist influenced ways of organizing movements and parties. So, for example, the Red Green Alliance and their youth organization, influenced by some of these types of organization, the individual is not subordinate to the decisions made by the whole, and it's more like a very big opposition to any kind of leadership. And because we had this existing structure of people being allowed to be member also in the parties, the people who agreed more with the parties, of course, they did not want us to start deciding to go our own way and making these analyses that might disagree with the parties on some things. So the main struggle and the main line struggle was on whether or not decisions made by the leadership or the Congress were to be carried out by the membership. And some major points of this struggle was about the election, when we had our version of a parliament election in Denmark in, I believe, 2022. And we decided to do an active boycott because we had no ability to exploit it in another way. And this was very controversial, not because people necessarily opposed boycotting it, but there was a big opposition to us being able to make this kind of decision. And this struggle paralyzed the organization for about a year after this, but eventually we were able to win out. And through that experience of that struggle, we really won a good party culture of understanding when and how to apply leadership. For example, that the departments and the members are subordinate to the decisions of the leadership, and that the leadership should always take and understand the criticism coming from below, but not every decision can be discussed before being able to move on it. So this sounds like a banal thing, but this is really something indescribably important if you are building up a pre-party organization, which is what the DKU partially became already at this point, because we decided to go our own way. Because if you're not basically applying a basic communist organizational model, you are going to be wasting energy and acting in a very inefficient manner on every single one of the tasks of the revolution that you put yourself forward to. And I think that this was a very major turning point in our development. This was basically the main line that opposed democratic centralism. And after this was completed, we had united around a communist organizational culture, but we had not united around a clear analysis of imperialism and Danish society. We hadn't united around a correct and concise political and ideological line. And this was what was basically the next things that were for us to deal with.
In the struggle around DC, did you lose some people, like people who were opposed to democratic centralism? Did you have some people leave your organization?
Yes, we had a minor group leave, and I think that that's very natural, because you should not just make decisions willy-nilly and just don't care about stepping people over the toes. You need to make the proper discussion. But in the long run, some people have a fundamentally petty bourgeois outlook or don't agree with the direction the organization is going. And actually, I've seen this in very many other organizations internationally. Sometimes you can have people decide, okay, we're not going to solve this problem of fundamental party culture, and the underlying contradictions just fester. And eventually you have a much larger split, a much larger problem that can actually wreck the organization. And we had this problem for the 1 year we were paralyzed, but eventually we were able to take it off. So there was a minor group that left. It was like about 1/5 of the organization or something like that. But we grew back, and that was fine.
Yeah, it's a very helpful point, because I think especially for a lot of young Maoist organizations getting started, there's a real fear of losing people. It's so hard to win people over. And then you have fundamental disagreements on communist principles and party culture, organizational culture. And people want to preserve that existing unity and really bow to liberalism in doing so. And what you said, it parallels our own experiences in MCU. It also parallels the history of the international communist movement, like the split with the Mensheviks, who opposed democratic centralism. The Bolsheviks lost some people, but they were stronger in the end for it. So it's great to hear a bit about those same historical lessons being confirmed in practice in Denmark. So earlier you mentioned the struggle for an internationalist and anti-imperialist analysis. That was sort of the next big struggle in the development of the DKU. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Well, basically, the defining question of the young communist movement at that time, and I believe still today, ideologically, is the view on China, and between that, Russia. But this is what really divides the waters. And some people say, oh, it's just another country out there, why do we have to deal with this? Why can't we just unite? But from this question of China, every other theoretical question really falls down after that, right? If you view China as a socialist country, then the tasks of the communist must also reflect that, right? You must defend them, you must draw experiences from that and apply that there. And it basically implies a fundamentally reformist outlook that basically hopes to use this emerging multipolarity world to make change in society. If you don't accept Chinese revisionism, and you actually see that it's a social imperialist and an imperialist power, and has been since 78, 76. The fundamental conclusion you must reach is that you stand with the responsibility to build the revolutionary movement in your country. There's not coming anyone to help you or save you. And also, you can have the entire experience of the Chinese Revolution contains such rich experience on everything from socialist construction to organizational forms to the fundamental approach you take when working with the working class or the masses. And having a misunderstanding or deception about the true character of this makes you not able to really gain from that. So, of course, a lot of line struggles tend to fall together, and the people that left there also had some people who supported China, but some stayed, and it was a more minor group that left because really we were already reuniting around anti-revisionist politics at this time. But yeah, the question of Russia, it's related, and it fell around the same time at the start of the war in Ukraine. We had, I think, correct analysis. We condemned the invasion, but we viewed it clearly as an inter-imperialist conflict. And especially in times like these, it's really important to stand very staunchly on this, because a lot of anti-war activists, of course, they're cheering now that it seems that Trump is putting an end to this or freezing this proxy conflict. But a lot of people can tend to now just view this as something very external to Russia that is just being put on them. But actually, both the US and Russia have been arming up, been moving positions closer to each other. And there's not one responsible for this mass murder of young Russian and Ukrainian men that's happened there. So overall, it's very important to take a clear position on the international situation.
Yeah, and you emphasized the importance of anti-imperialist perspective on this. I think it's quite key. And a lot of organizations, even that call themselves Marxist, when they say anti-imperialist, they just refer to correctly supporting anti-imperialist struggles in oppressed countries. But they don't also take that anti-imperialist analysis to something like the Ukraine war and see the proxy conflict, or to looking squarely at Chinese social imperialism as imperialism. Those are very fundamental and defining things in the world today, especially as we see the escalation towards World War III. So in this line struggle, I'm assuming this had reverberations in terms of the organizing work that you all were doing in the DKU at the time. Could you just talk at least briefly about some of those changes that came about as this struggle played out and as you consolidated around a genuine anti-imperialist and internationalist line?
Well, in the beginning, when we started organizing, we were really building from ground zero. So we were just learning how to put up banners and posters and doing these very basic actions. And being so internally split really paralyzed us from being able to lead any kind of work, because you're going out there and putting two different lines out. So we were more stapling ourselves onto different movements in the beginning, right? And I think that the most important thing that happened that we were working on was our theoretical work in this time. But after we reached some of this relative unity, we started focusing a lot more on we wanted to get out there, we wanted to organize, and doing this, we've always had people who were active in labor unions, but we haven't had a big enough presence that we were able to have a focused participation. And this really also shows the importance of developing full-time revolutionaries and people who can be prioritized, and you can gather your forces in one place, because even though we have learned a lot from a lot of these struggles, you can only lead it if you have a few people concentrated in one place. I think our first experiences with doing some actual large-scale organizing was we participated in some of the anti-fascist movements up back in 2023, when there was some small fascist groups that were trying to hold meetings, and we participated in these blockades of this. And then October 7 happened, and this suddenly turned the situation completely on its head. There was suddenly a lot of people looking to be organized, looking to go in there, and we made a lot of our first very big experiences in how to do quote-unquote mass work, or organizing people through the early Palestine Solidarity Network and Palestine actions, where we were a part of organizing within these spaces alongside a lot of other individuals and groups, but where we had a more collective presence in doing blockades of weapon facilities like Therma in Denmark. For us, it was a necessity for us to be able to have more effective and united work with organizing outside the organization. We needed a higher internal unity, and I think that's the main takeaway.
Yeah, that's very helpful and helps to make more concrete for the audience the link between theory and practice and these ideological and theoretical struggles. And yeah, you can't do united front work if you're not internally united. So it's a really key lesson. It sounds like the kind of timing too of the struggle was very key with the Palestine protests happening towards the tail end of it. So then you were able to really launch yourself into that work in a much more unified fashion. So you had mentioned that after these struggles around anti-imperialism and coming to an internationalist line, there was a third kind of struggle in the organization, line struggle. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
We had adopted a basically correct view of imperialism and the world around us. We had realized the need to form a party because there was not a revolutionary communist party present in Denmark, but we still hadn't consolidated around a clear ideological line. And because we always took this ideological question very seriously, we knew that this was a major goal point for us to be able to actually completely unite our organization and be able to move towards party building process in a more direct fashion than building up a youth organization. The importance of building a youth organization is that we have found advantages in it, in that there's a lot of young people who are interested in communism right now, and the people in the millennial generation and above, there's a kind of a gap where people who have lived through kind of the 90s and that part has a very low interest, at least where we are. So we haven't had a problem with being a youth organization for a little while, and it's been an opportunity to get a lot of people who are interested in communism and might not have already been ready to join a party, but who were still willing to join a youth organization. But we still find it very important that the party building process is central. And that's where the ideological question is also needed to be covered up. So I think that this final step of saying, okay, we're an anti-revisionist organization, but what is an actual anti-revisionist line? We were studying what Hojaism meant, and also these other kinds of formulations like Greek views of Marxism, Leninism. But overall, we had Gonzaloists in the organization and running parallel to the organization for a long time. And I think this was something that made us a little bit more skeptical to moving towards Maoism, because we sometimes conflated Gonzaloism with Maoism. I think this actually happens in a lot of organizations out there internationally, where they think that Maoism is synonymous with this people's war in the First World and the militarization of the party and this little bit weird cultish behavior. But we were able to distinguish, and for that reason, we were able to kind of move towards uniting around Maoism. There wasn't really a strong support for the other kinds of quote-unquote anti-revisionist lines, even though there really is only one anti-revisionist line. So we didn't suffer any kind of split in the moving towards Maoism. It was more a natural conclusion of our development through these previous struggles. And through applying Maoism and building our organization on that, we have been able to link up with other organizations internationally and gain a lot of experience from that.
Great. Yeah, that's very helpful to hear about, and really focusing on the centrality of party building. Obviously, for countries like Denmark, also like the United States, and many imperialist countries right now where there's not a real communist party, it's a key task. So to unify around ideological line being an essential precondition for that is very key. Okay, so I think now the audience will have a sense of, some of the background of the DKU, how you all got started, the struggles that led you to become what you are today. And it's a pretty impressive story, starting as the youth organization jointly kind of for two revisionist parties to where you are today, uniting around MLM, a very inspiring story. Can you talk a little bit, though, about what the DKU does at present, what you all are doing, key struggles you're involved in, work, key ideological questions in front of you?
Well, we have been focusing on Bolshevizing our organization and building an organization that is capable to take up the struggles necessarily. And we've also decided that just going out and going to all the Palestine protests and doing all the actions is not an efficient strategy for making revolution, because there's some basic questions about the revolution in Denmark that need to be answered for us to be able to advance. And therefore, our main areas of work right now are building up a strong theoretical analysis, because even though we prioritized theoretical work previously, we hadn't done it in a collective manner. So we've been finding some major tasks that we've wanted to tackle, and we're starting to have been over the last little bit over a half year working on these to be able to have a more clear analysis of Danish society. Overall, around Bolshevizing the organization, even though we have, on a cognitive level understood that we want to have a strong and democratic centralist organization, that doesn't mean that all the functions of the organization actually function that way. So we've been implementing greater degree of criticism, self-criticism within our departments and our organs of the organization, and applying a cell structure within local departments to be able to much more efficiently do local actions and work. And we've been having a lot of success with this, it being a much more efficient way for us of organizing on a local level. And we are focusing on building our organization, winning people in. And we have also been preparing 8th of March demonstration, where we have been doing some open meetings where we are doing movie showings, where we invite people in and we watch feminist movies like Red Detachment of Women we watched recently. And we're leading up to a 8th of March event, but mainly we are building up our organization, so we're going to have bigger capabilities. And this theoretical work is also taking a lot of the time of a lot of our cadres. Basically, we are focusing on two major questions. One is that we figured that for our presence in the Palestine movement, we can't just be tailing after these kind of a little bit anarchist-led movements that are doing really valiant and good struggle, but are doing it on a confused basis sometimes. We can't just be supporting these quantitatively by helping to push it along, because that's not going to make it successful in achieving the aims of the movement by itself. So therefore, one of the theoretical tasks we put before ourselves is to develop a more all-round pamphlet that explains the international situation, major anti-imperialist struggles around the world, and tackles some of deviating theories within anti-imperialist work in general, so that we can raise the level of our members and other advanced people in anti-imperialist and Palestine solidarity circles to try to actually, instead of just tailing after these movements, helping to lift them and lead them by pointing the way. The other major theoretical task we put before ourselves is to work towards a preliminary class analysis of Denmark. This question is utterly essential if we want to advance as an organization, because we have sometimes been guilty of a negative tendency of just organizing wherever it's possible to organize, or just basing our strategic evaluations of where to organize on where it seems that there might be a opportune moment to put some forces, without a more thoroughgoing understanding of what makes a particular group of people or a particular area of struggle an advantageous place to put your forces. So to be able to advance, we've been organizing this theoretical study, and the way we're doing this is that we have different subgroups. One that tries to get a lot more clear on Marxist political economy, which the Danish communist left is completely illiterate on. There's not any of the parties that have basically an inch of understanding. There's some really terrible surface level understandings going around, and that's been a major issue. The other things that the groups are doing is also trying to collect data and statistics from different Danish bourgeois outlets about the composition of the Danish population, so we can be more clear about understanding that, and also having a group that is trying to analyze the class analysis of other groups in Denmark currently or in the past, to try to understand what the line struggles around class analysis have been. These are already giving us a lot more of a clarified understanding, but it's just some baby steps. Also, we are organizing a revolutionary summer camp, which is something that we've been using to try to have a place where a lot of young, interested revolutionary communists can come, and we have a lot of social activities and mixed with a lot of theoretical presentations and discussions, and it being a meeting point for young revolutionary-minded people. We held it last year. It was a success, but we're looking to make it a lot bigger this year. So this is another thing we're working on.
That's a great overview, and very exciting to hear about the very dynamic work that you all are doing. I'll say, just on the Bolshevization efforts, it's an essential task, I think, for Maoist organizations today. It's also important to remember that it's a constant, ongoing battle to develop, maintain, and solidify Bolshevization. For example, as I'm sure you know, CPI Maoist has recently concluded a Bolshevization campaign a few years ago, and if a party leading such a huge revolutionary movement, it's been in existence in various forms for, well, CPI Maoist since 2004, but its prior iterations for decades, is still carrying out campaigns to Bolshevization its ranks, it speaks to precisely what you're talking about, which is, on the one hand, orgs can have some degree of that and nominally adhere to that, but then also on another level, there could be some cognitive dissonance or some lack of alignment of thinking and doing that happens. And so, yeah, it's a constant process to fight to maintain that sort of proletarian discipline. And your answer also, it reminded me a bit of what Lenin says in Left-Wing Communism about, on the one hand, the conditions of the Bolshevik success being tied to the practical experience they had, incredibly rich and unparalleled at that point anywhere in the world. But on the other hand, to the incredible veracity they had for theory, just to every single bit of theory the Russian Marxists could get their hand on, they gobbled up and analyzed. And yeah, these things real class analysis, understanding political economy, they're essential if MLM organizations are going to make steps beyond the baby steps that have been taken in the last few decades in imperialist countries. I mean, obviously, for the leading MLM parties around the world, they've carried these things out in their own respective countries. But for those of us in the imperialist powers, it's really time to pick up the slack, basically. So it's great to hear about you all doing that work. And I'm very excited to see the stuff that comes out of it, the pamphlet and other work. So building off of that, can you tell us a little more about what are the prospects for party building in Denmark? What's it looking like over the next few years?
The prospects for building is great, but I think that the founding of the Communist Party is a little bit off still. So of course we had the old Danish Communist Party from the 20s, and who was had some major struggles. It was the largest communist party that's been in Denmark, and it notably had a great influence in the working class. It participated by sending 500 to the Spanish Civil War, and it led a armed resistance, even though it was a little reluctant to start it, but it did initiate the armed resistance towards Nazi occupation in Denmark, unlike some of the other countries in the north. So those are some proud moments of the Danish Communist Party, but it fell like a lot of communist parties to revisionism. They thought, we are a people's democracy, we can unite with the Social Democratic Party, but of course you have not vanquished the bourgeoisie's military forces, so it's not possible to do something like that. So after this, there was groups who were looking to found a new communist party. They were just sometimes people within the Danish Communist Party who was particularly sympathetic to the Chinese Revolution, and these kind of groups preceded what was called the KFML, Kommunistisk Forbund Marxist-Leninister. And this group was kind of the main anti-revisionist group and quote-unquote pre-Maoist, before Maoism really existed. The group suffered several splits where different tendencies broke off, in this common thing that happens. And actually during the aftermath of the 70s Vietnam War movement, they founded the party KAP, Kommunistisk Arbejderparti. And this was the biggest nominally communist party that's been since the Danish Communist Party. But it had a lot of major flaws from the beginning. We haven't gotten very deep into this, but there was issues with the class analysis and putting too much emphasis on students. But overall, major problems were its very staunch support for the three worlds theory, where it said that basically they were supporting the right-wing line in China. They supported the politics coming out from Deng Xiaoping as an international ambassador to the UN from the People's Republic of China. And after the fall of socialism in China, they continued to support the government as it became revisionist, and they quickly denigrated from their highest membership number of around 1,000 members down to 400 and 300, and eventually they joined into a big left unity alliance, and everyone forgot about them. And the sort of left opposition to this was no better. It was led by KAK, and these are the people who are the origin of this kind of snylterstates theory, or what you know as Maoism third worldism, which is this kind of idea of giving up on revolution in the first world to just send money to Palestine, really abandoning the hard task of the revolution to the oppressed nations of the world, which is kind of a chauvinist position, ironically. So these were the major Maoesque aligned organizations that faded out late in the 80s. And since then, there's not really been any Maoist presence. It's been dominated by different alternative Marxist-Leninist strands. There's been different party building attempts in the 70s and the new communist movement that I won't go into that aren't as important. But basically, there's a long history of trying to build a new communist party in Denmark as well. And we're not the first to work towards that. So for us, a really important step in actually making these is going much deeper on how these previous pre-party formations and attempt at building the party theorized doing this and how they made mistakes, and really drawing on this rich 70-year history of attempting to found the party. So that's a little bit on the history and the abstract, but in the concrete, because of the basic collapse of the communist movement, there's a very low number of people who are at like a cadre level in Denmark, even out in the parties. If you assume that there's some people in the nominally communist parties that might be won over to Maoism, there's not enough advanced people who are developed to be cadres to unite just around a party at the current time. And therefore, there's a lot more painstaking long-term work to be done in building this up. And this is some of what we can do in the DKU, being a school for communists, trying to turn young people into Maoist cadres. But other than that, in the midterm work towards building the party, there's a lot of important questions that need to be answered, such as class analysis, revolutionary strategy. What program is this party actually going to be based around? This is some of the preparations that have been made, but we have only taken the baby steps towards this. So for us, I think that it's unlikely there's going to be a founded communist party in Denmark within the next 5 years, because the forces are at a very low level. But we have seen a lot of advance in the last 4 years, so things can go very fast. I'm very positively inclined.
Well, thanks for that detailed breakdown of the history of the Danish communist movement. It's very helpful to hear a bit of the background and the perspective you outlined of drawing on the last 70 years of party building experience is really essential to take seriously the task in front of us as Maoists to build up new parties in the imperialist countries or even in the press countries where there aren't existing parties. Without that history, it's effectively impossible. We don't want to start from scratch all over again. In terms of the party building efforts, I think what you outlined makes sense. We want to be optimistic, but not naively optimistic, and imagine the party's going to just fall from the sky. So one key aspect of party building is obviously the effort to fuse with the working class movement. So could you describe a little bit more, what's the state of the working class movement in Denmark?
Denmark is very peculiar. I think if you compare the Danish labor system to America, it's going to seem very alien. It's similar to the Scandinavian countries, but I think I need, for mainly maybe American or international audience, I'm going to give a little bit of historical context to understand how this came to be. The main bourgeois ruling party in the last about 90 years has been the Social Democratic Party. The Social Democratic Party had long been one of the bourgeois labor parties. And basically during the 1930s, the Danish bourgeoisie, who had been led by more of like these right-wing, more openly reactionary parties for a long time, due to the threat of communism and fascism, decided to go in an agreement with the Social Democratic Party and allow them to gain some political power. And, of course, later they won more bigger elections. And after this, there has basically become a sort of compromise between labor and capital, or organized labor, where labor unions have been allowed to grow and take more control, but the system has been built up around sector-wide agreements between the labor unions and the capital, but they work as kind of friendly opposed forces. So the Danish labor participation has been extremely high. It's still above 80% in Denmark, and the union participation, it's just in many sectors just completely an assumption that you will always be in a union, but it's heavily apoliticized. The Social Democratic Party, in the beginning, it was still seen as something of a pride and something you did as a principle to be active in your labor union, but there has been a sort of a pacifization process over the last 70 years, basically, that the labor unions, while having a huge labor movement, actual participation in the meetings and in the actual organizing of the labor movement and the way that people identify with being workers has denigrated over a very long time. Especially in the last 30 years, there's a bigger presence of yellow unions, which don't organize agreements, but just provide some benefits like summer vacation or stuff like that, and the other just basic union functions. And the response of the big quote-unquote red unions, the social democratic-led unions, has been to try to assimilate some of these tactics into themselves. They try to provide bonuses and you can get a discount in these stores and stuff like that. But the actual participation in the unions has been dropping and the membership has been dropping. But at the same time, the Danish system is built around these collective agreements where on sector-wide basis, you still have these unions that represent a dwindling number of members, or even though it's relatively large, that make these agreements. So there's a contradiction here where we're in a situation where this system is still in place, but it's in a process of disintegration. And eventually there's going to be more room for these kind of different labor unions, or for maybe some sectors to move away from collective agreements. And this is a difficult environment to work within as labor organizing, because it's so integrated into the state system that the unions are heavily depoliticized in this way. So there's been different lines in the Danish communist movement throughout history on how to tackle this question. One has been to build separate revolutionary unions, which has seen very little success. Another one has been to try to build a labor opposition within the existing union movement. But overall, there hasn't been a successful attempt at building up a major labor opposition. The revisionist Danish Communist Party had a major group of labor leaders under them in the 70s, but they were not basing it on revolutionary politics. They were more acting as a left social democratic opposition to the social democratic leadership. So today in the labor movement, this is the nut that we need to crack, because you are put in a difficult position where a lot of the struggles are about preserving elements of this system, this kind of reactionary system, about these three-way meetings between capital, labor, and the government, all kind of represented by the Social Democratic Party. And, when these kind of organizations being ripped away, you stand in a position as communist where you're like, okay, we're going to have to defend the social democratic system against worsening conditions for the workers. So that's a difficult position to be in, because actually, as communists, we see this as a reactionary system. We think that the labor unions should not view themselves as friends or people who just need to make a deal with the representatives of the capitalist organization, but that they should preserve a fighting stance and fight for these things, and then win the concessions. And I think that this has shown that the Danish bourgeoisie has been quite apt in their method for trying to pacifize the workers' movement. recently our Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, on a podcast said about the coming times that, I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but she says, I'm not just saying this as a social democrat, but if you don't secure the social safety in society, then the isms come, meaning communism, Nazism, fascism, Islamism. And she said this to, some major bourgeois paper leaders, right? But I think this shows kind of the thinking of the Danish bourgeoisie. But this is just the social democratic side. There's a lot of other ones pushing for privatization who just want to get rid of this labor system. And I think that it's inevitable that this social safety that she's talking about is going to be ripped away because of the constant drive for profit and the worsening international position of European capital. And we've seen wages denigrate over a long time. We've seen benefits and welfare state being slowly taken apart piece by piece, even though it's slow. So I think that they won't be able to sustain this kind of system. And I don't believe that revolution was impossible in the 20th century, even though the system existed, but it was definitely not something that the communists who had these kind of opportunist tendencies of attempting to unite with the Social Democratic Party right after the World War II were, instead of combating them. These definitely didn't have the spines to oppose this system being set up.
Yeah, that's very helpful what you broke down. And I like how you put it, like this is the nut to crack. It's very much the case. And if you look at the experiences that in the US, there's a lot of differences, but this same nut was never fully cracked. The Communist Party similarly had some oppositional orgs. They tried independent unions in 1929 under the guidance of the Comintern. Those didn't quite work, like independent red unions. Then when they went back into the unions, they had some success, but were eventually co-opted into the new system of like labor capital management relations that became the AFL-CIO, especially in the post-World War II era. So even though 80% union participation is a far cry from what we have here in the US, which is the 10%, and in the private sector, like 6% or something, there's important common threads there. It's very exciting to hear about you all in the DKU dealing with this very central question that communists are confronting right now. Again, especially in the imperialist countries, of how do we really wrest leadership of the working class movement from these misleaders of labor who have had ideological dominance with the guidance, blessing, and support of the bourgeoisie for, well, the better part of a century at this point. Could you describe the positive and negative trends that exist in the left in Denmark? You've spoken about these a little bit earlier in the interview, but it'd be helpful to break it down a little more. Obviously, there's, a lot of similarities in left activist scenes in different countries, but also some important particularities.
Well, I think that the major streams of opportunism that we're dealing with is one, a conciliatory or class collaborationist approach to class struggle, which is spearheaded by the Social Democratic Party and many other social democratic parties, like the Socialist People's Party, the Red Green Alliance, and all these other, we have a lot of parties in Denmark, but they do the same thing. The approach, which is kind of brought to illusion by this kind of labor capital, quote unquote, compromise, which is really the subservience of labor to capital, has led a lot of petty bourgeois leaders of these left-wing parties to spread illusions about the nature of Denmark, as some academics bring it forward as it's not a class society because there's so much middle class. It's just one big gradient and everyone benefits. And we got capitalism, but without the bad parts. And we got socialism with democracy. And these illusions run really deep. Even you talk to some like people who are like, yeah, I like revolution. I want free Palestine. I want to have a socialist revolution. Then you talk to them and they still like have some kind of subconscious fundamental belief that Denmark is completely different to other countries in the world, and that we're not living in a bourgeois dictatorship, that the working class has an exceptional level of power, which is really not in accordance with what's happening or the worsening conditions that the majority of the population are facing. And also, especially in the last 10 years, migrants from the Middle East have been hounded with some really brutally strict immigration laws and very hard path to citizenship and just harassment overall. Other than this conciliatory tendency, there's this, I spoke on it already, but widespreading influence of this kind of NGO movementist anarchism, where it came alongside this postmodern philosophy, but it penetrates everything. Even these so-called communist parties and the mass orgs they lead are all based on this kind of huge fear for leadership and for any kind of organizational structure or discipline. Like when you go and you initiate a new struggle, when something like the Palestine thing happens, or in different movements, when there's organizations, there's a huge pushback from some of these petty bourgeois or bourgeois elements that this movement cannot have any kind of decision-making ability. Everyone has to be constantly changed from leadership and you cannot delegate any responsibility. And it cannot be described how paralyzing this is for making any kind of action. Basically, there's a fundamental belief just as in there's can be no leaders, there can also be no real uniting strategy. All strategies have to coincide. So for example, in the Palestine movement, it's impossible to have a united discussion of how to advance as a movement because there's kind of like a fundamental opposition to even the concept of unity or the striving for it, as it's seen as some kind of totalitarian or reactionary striving. And also this kind of tendency of turning protests and actions into anarchist commune. This was a problem with the student encampments, which was a really a noble attempt, and it did something that hadn't been done for a while, but it quickly denigrated into turning inside. Even though it had such a big support, there were so many other universities that were ready to go on, but it just ended up focusing more on building the community inside there because it felt it was a capitalist way of thinking, wanting to grow the movement. And this is the kind of things that you have to struggle against. So I think this movementist anarchism and just reformist illusions are the main two trends. Other than that, if we're talking specifically in communist or youth spaces, there's been a big problem with a lot of confusion about the nature of the international situation, the relationship with China. You see this online. All the big outlets, of course, until we have Marxism today, but it's still, of course, not the biggest. You have a lot of big YouTubers and outlets talking about some much more multipolarist politics or unclear political lines, and this has effects here too. Danish people, they watch American media, they kind of on a pseudo level view themselves as half Americans, and they also take all the same internet stuff. So you'll see the same tendencies that you guys meet here, and this is the same stuff we have to work with and struggle with.
Thanks for that overview. There's a lot of similarities. Obviously, the institutionalization of the social democratic parties and the large revisionist parties changes the political landscape, but the basic deviations you're describing, we have a lot of those same exact things in the US. And it was surprising to hear about the opposition from the revisionist parties to kind of structure and leadership in the mass movement. It makes sense because they're so politically spineless that they kind of tail whatever the kind of ideology of the movement is. Yeah, I wouldn't have expected that. So I want to circle back to a point you raised earlier, namely the declining status of European capital and the shifting strategy of the Danish bourgeoisie. I know that your organization is still in the process of carrying out a class analysis that hasn't published on this topic, but could you give a little bit of an overview of these developments and how this really could impact the stability of the class dictatorship of the Danish bourgeoisie going forward?
I can say some preliminary things on these questions. I think the Danish bourgeoisie has been, I see it kind of as an artery in the Western Bloc. You know, it's a small country, but it has some very important big monopolist groups like Maersk, who is a transportation giant, and then Novo Nordisk, who has the Ozempic and the big other drugs. But the Danish bourgeoisie has basically, they joined NATO at an early time, and right after the war was one of the early ones, and it also joined the thing before the European Union in the 70s. And I think the Danish bourgeoisie has been characterized as sitting pretty comfortably in the kind of contradictory position between the EU and NATO, whereas countries like France maybe has had more struggle with the US. Denmark until now has found itself being able to not have too many conflicting interests with these blocs, but the increasing friction and we've seen in the previous period has put the Danish bourgeoisie in a difficult position, right? Because they have been very gung-ho on the Ukraine war, and they are also been very close to USA and also very close to the EU centers. With the Trump's overtures to buying Greenland has displeased, of course, the Danish bourgeoisie, but at the same time, they are really willing to give even more American bases in Danish ground and just give anything that is asked for. But now that the Ukraine war is happening, they are being forced to stand in one place. They really, at least normally disagree with the US pulling the rug on Ukraine, but at the same time accepting more military bases from the US. So previously there has been splits in the bourgeoisie. You have some minor parties like the Youth for the Conservative Party and some outer parties. They have been more EU skeptic, and they are saying we should lean more towards Britain and NATO and the US center. They're not saying leave, they're saying lean more this way or lean more that way. But overall, there's not anyone articulating a kind of break with the US or a break with EU or where they should position themselves in that. And I don't think the bloc is breaking up either completely. But overall, I think we're in a period of an ideological crisis in the bourgeoisie of being able to justify the policies that are going to be necessary. And this like free market liberalism really focused on these multilateral agreements and on this Atlantic alliance is so deeply ingrained across the political spectrum of bourgeois leaders. The way they think about and are taught to think about the world. There's not kind of an analogy to Trumpism here that can justify a kind of shift. So I'm very curious to see what's going to happen, but that's just an outline of things.
So you mentioned Greenland, and obviously this has been a huge thing in the news in the US, I'm sure in Denmark and internationally. And I know the DKU has released a statement on Greenland and this kind of conflict between the US and Denmark over control. Could you just break down your organization's position on the matter?
Yeah. To give a little bit of context, the Kingdom of Denmark has a long time ago conquered Greenland, and they have been subduing and basically had some ethnic cleansing programs also to replace some of the Greenlandish population. Even going back to the 70s, there was some of this stuff going on, and there's a really deep chauvinistic view in Denmark towards this question, where it's like this social democratic view where they see we are the good colonizers by paying a lot of money to run the Greenlandish state, and Danish people are taught to see this as some kind of charity, but we are paying to have a state that runs Greenland for our interests. And basically the Danish bourgeoisie has a lot of international geopolitical power because it controls the largest island in the world in this very critical region. And it's been able to rent out a part of it to the US with the Thule base for many years, and exploiting Greenland's fishing resources, particularly by a lot of Danish companies being able to dominate that. There is a minor Greenlandic bourgeoisie, but really the vast majority of corporations that are exploiting the natural resources and labor of Greenland are from Denmark, a few from the Faroe Islands, which is another colonial possession of the Danish kingdom. And I think that in recent times, there's a lot more conversation about this, because now with the Trump having offered to buy Greenland, Greenland has gotten nominal independence already in the last 20 years, where they've been able to have their own government, which has some representation in the Danish parliament. I would say it's kind of a little bit between a semi-colony and a full colony, right? Because it has some of their nominally owned organizations, but Denmark controls the foreign relations and really all economic aspects. And this mask is ripped off this relationship when Trump clearly believes he can buy Greenland from Denmark, because it's seen as, okay, we're all freely within this Danish kingdom together. So some people on the right in Denmark, in relation to this kind of provocative statements by Trump, have been saying, okay, let's just do it, let's sell it. The prime minister has been taking more of a position of this is never going to happen. But behind closed doors, there's definitely going on negotiations about major concessions in the area, where Greenland is being traded like just some commodity or piece of land. And suddenly the Danish state is saying we're going to promote anti-Greenlandic racism in the schools and coming with all sorts of things, trying to win this away because, there's been some demands for being a vote for Greenland to leave, which would basically make it a US colony, which is something that the US actually has been using to break away colonies from the old European powers for a very long time. Overall, the DKU's position is we deeply condemn the bartering over the future of Greenland, and that we believe that Greenland should have independent development. But of course, currently with the forces there are, little bourgeoisie there is in Greenland is very wavering. If there is to be a secession from Denmark, it will probably be to becoming a US semi-colony. And that's something we can support or oppose as communists. It's just these imperialist bartering over Greenland. So overall, we call for the building up of the working class movement and the Communist Party in Denmark, Greenland, and USA as building up the means to put a strong opposition to these plans, because currently in Greenland there's no political forces that represent these kind of independent proletarian or even national liberation politics. And actually, the Danish bourgeoisie has been very aware that the revolutionary potential, in particular Greenland, but also the Faroe Islands, is in a large part of the 20th century. The Danish communists and members of the Danish Communist Party were banned from going to Greenland because they feared the building up of the movement there. We've sometimes had some contacts with some comrades, but we've not been able to support the building of that there. But that's a major priority. If there's opportunities that show themselves, we want to find ways to support the building of movements in the Danish colonies.
Thanks for that detailed answer. And as you put it, it lays quite bare the logic of imperialism, literally bartering over a future of a whole people. It's also notable that with climate change, cynically, the bourgeoisie is looking, wow, there's going to be a lot of ice melt in Greenland, a lot more natural resources to pull out of the earth, pretty cynical calculus. And then, of course, one thing you didn't mention, but something we've been talking about here in the US is the role of Greenland in inter-imperialist conflict. You mentioned indirectly with the US base there. The US ruling class is very worried about competition in the Arctic, especially with the Russian capabilities militarily and even economically with their shipping and oil drilling and so on being far superior to the United States in its bloc. So it seems that Trump and the section of the bourgeoisie that supports him see Greenland as a key staging base for expanding US imperialist presence in the Arctic region.
And particularly also because there's opening a new trade route or transportation route north of Greenland, which is becoming possible now, which is also making the region even more strategically important.
Yeah, absolutely. And so all the more important for communists in Denmark and the US to stand firmly against the imperialist machinations of our respective bourgeoisies. Yes, thanks for breaking that down. And you all put out a statement on your social media about this, correct?
Yeah, you can also find it on Proletarian Perspectives, which is something maybe we'll talk about a little bit later, but we can put the link in the description.
Yeah, so we'll be sure to include a link to that in the description for the video so the audience can check it out. And yeah, we'll talk about Proletarian Perspectives in a bit, but it's becoming an important platform for discussion and debate amongst Maoist forces, as well as posting some important documents from the history of the international communist movement. So you've talked a bit about the history of the communist movement in Denmark, but I know also there's rich tradition of communist movement in Scandinavia more broadly, and in particular in recent years, some real efforts across Scandinavia to reconstitute Maoist organizations and parties. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I can definitely say a few words on that. We're lucky in Scandinavia that both in Norway and Sweden, there are pre-party organizations that are starting to take the first steps towards building towards a Maoist Communist Party in those countries. They've actually been around for a little bit longer than the DKU has consolidated towards Maoism. There's been problems in the Scandinavian countries, as there has in the US, of the Maoist movement kind of being dominated by these Gonzaloist trends. And that's been a major struggle that's kind of been holding them back for a little while. But after this has been cleared up, they've been able to advance a lot more. And actually recently in Sweden, the two groups which had earlier split around some minor issues have reunited as a stronger pre-party organization, the Kommunistiske Arbejderforbundet, it's called in Sweden, KAF, and in Norway it's Revolutionary Communist League. And this is a very strong, even though it's on a smaller level, it's a very strong tool to have regional allies within these countries who have such similar political systems and methods of bourgeois rule as we have, for example, in Denmark. So we are looking to build further with those relations and see if we can use each other as help in developing some of these really important analyses of how to, for example, tackle the labor system that is peculiar to these countries, and also questions like the EU and stuff like that. So even though that the Maoist movement in last long time has been definitely centered around Southeast Asia, there's been happening some things in Europe as well, and we're looking forward to seeing a lot more comrades uniting around the revolutionary line.
Yeah, it's very exciting. And for those who don't know in the audience, it wasn't just the communist forces in Denmark in the 60s and 70s that were significant. The parties in Sweden and Norway were also very large, especially relative to their population size, and had huge influence culturally. So there's a rich tradition, even in recent years, to draw on. So that's very exciting. So you mentioned obviously the center of the Maoist movement, really the communist movement, being in the oppressed countries in India and the Philippines in particular. And on the one hand, there's a lot that we can learn from these movements and really incredible inspiration they've given to the international communist movement, holding high the banner of communism in these last long 50 years of reaction. But on the other hand, there's obviously some negative trends towards passivity, groups sitting around and waiting for the revolution in the oppressed countries to kind of give us the answers or win there first so that then things can get started in imperialist countries. So could you talk a little bit about the inspiration these movements have given you all, and just more broadly, the tasks of communists in imperialist countries right now, as we really want to avoid falling into that passivity? And from what you've been saying, and from having talked to you all on the DKU a bit before, I can see that you very much have been playing an active role in working to build up the Maoist movement in Denmark.
Yeah, this is a really important question, actually. The People's Wars in India and the Philippines represent something that has so much meaning because they are the bridge of the experience of the old revolutionary tradition of Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism in that unity, and bring over the deep understanding and culture and tradition as a bridge between the old movement and the new. And from this, we've been able to advance leaps and bounds, something that would take us probably the whole existence of our organization to answer these important basic theoretical questions, reading the works coming from these countries and being able to be inspired by the fact that they're still fighting in the blackest period of reaction we've had in these last 50 years. But something that we can't do is just mechanically try to ape and imply their strategies here in Denmark. And this is something that the Gonzaloists are fought for, and also something that was present in the wider Maoist movement in Europe in the last 20 years. There has been a sort of a theoretical laziness where, okay, we support the People's Wars and we take stuff from there, but we don't really take the big theoretical questions of our own movements here seriously. And I think this puts some emphasis on the actually really important task we have in front of us, because Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, and revolutionary communism hasn't been applied to a modern industrial capitalist country other than the October Revolution, which still had some very major differences, but there hasn't been a complete and total application to conditions that are similar to the ones we have today. So we have to really go at it with the creative application of MLM that you saw from Lenin and a Mao when they creatively applied Marxism in their own countries. This kind of approach we deeply need when we're devising how to build up a revolutionary movement in countries that are quite similar, like Denmark or the USA or China or any of these big imperialist powers.
Yeah, that's well said. And you mentioned the Gonzaloists in the last two remarks, so I'd be remiss not to take that opportunity just to say, we've seen in the US the incredible kind of destructive impact they've had over the last 10 years in the US of party building efforts, longer, really 15 years. The Gonzaloists played a leading role in kind of promoting dogmatism and sabotaging those efforts by precisely doing the things you were warning against, mechanically applying lessons in a dogmatic fashion to conditions that just they're not applicable to. That is to say, there's a lot of lessons to draw from the Chinese Revolution, from the experiences in Peru, from India and the Philippines today, but to blindly apply them to a highly industrialized imperialist country is silly. And in contrast, the parties in India and the Philippines have repeatedly emphasized, just as Mao emphasized himself, to not do this and to really make a concrete analysis of a concrete situation. Even in speaking to representatives in the 60s and 70s from Latin American countries, Mao emphasized that, yes, your countries are semi-feudal in many respects, but you shouldn't try to mechanically apply what we did in China. You need to really study your own countries. The point you made about the bridge, too, is also very important. And it's a point that's really not just the Gonzaloists, but a lot of young Maoists in the last decade or so in the United States, and I'm sure elsewhere too, have really not taken seriously. For example, in a lot of the CPI Maoists writing, they talk extensively about the experiences of the Comintern, and even their campaign to Bolshevize their ranks in the last few years has been based on the Comintern campaigns to Bolshevize the ranks of organizations like the Communist Party of Germany, the CPUSA, etc. In the positive lessons from the Comintern period, organizations like CPI Maoist and the Communist Party of the Philippines have really studied deeply and have been promoting. And in order to really rebuild the communist movements in the imperialist countries, we need to really grasp those lessons very, very clearly, because throwing those to the side has generally led to MLM organizations taking up effectively a heterogeneous admixture of some Maoism and a lot of postmodernism, tailing the big movementist protests, not really engaging in class analysis, not going to the working class and trying to bring about a fusion of the working class and Marxism, and really just making some very basic mistakes. And in MCU in our early days, we actually repeated some of these mistakes, not uncommon given the historical conditions that we emerged in. But through really studying this, and in particular some of the works from the comrades in India and the Philippines, it really opened our eyes to a lot of the confusions we had and helped us transform. So it's great to hear your very concise articulation about the importance of doing so.
I'd like to add on the bridge. I think that this is kind of an analysis and a view that kind of came to us because of our conditions, because we've been lacking a bridge in the Danish communist movement. There hasn't been a continuous anti-revisionist or Maoist trend that has been able to give to us some of these basic understandings of questions of revolutionary communism applied to Danish conditions, basic questions of organization. And this has been something that has been crippling to be able to have to fight from the bottom up. And I really think that this is on an international scale something they've been able to provide.
Yeah, absolutely. And similarly, the legacy was cut in the US with the degeneration of the RCP. And there's a few older communists, thankfully, who didn't degenerate from that period. Independent communists, non-party communists who shared some of the lessons, positive and negative, from that earlier period with us in the US. But it's not the same as having that organizational continuity. So you really have to learn a lot from scratch.
We didn't even have that kind of thing, so that's been a constraining factor, but not something you can't overcome, of course.
No, it just makes it harder. It really does. Okay, so I guess in closing, it would be good to talk a little bit about Proletarian Perspectives. I know you mentioned it earlier. Could you just explain a little bit what that forum is and why your documents are up there and why the audience may be interested in following it?
Yeah, I'm really glad you went back to this actually, because Proletarian Perspectives is an international Maoist theoretical journal, and it's helping to really bridge a Maoist analysis and bringing this discussion from the different countries together as something that in the long term can help building the unity on an international scale to build a new communist international. This is, of course, what we need. We need a high level of unity between communists on an international scale. And the first steps of building this are participating in these dialogues and conversations. So we really recommend that you read these discussions as they're going on, and if you are a burgeoning pre-party organization in any country of the world, to participate in these discussions, because it's extremely important. The main difference kind of building up all these small parties in the world that we live in today versus the one we had in the 20s is that there's no Comintern in the back, there's no Soviet Union guiding us, and really while these parties in the People's Wars are able to act as a bridge, they cannot act as a bridge between us in the same way as the Comintern could, that they just simply don't have the forces to do that. And that's why we also have to really just at a step-by-step level start building unity on an international basis by having conversations about the crucial aspects of theory, because there's a lot of universals, there's a lot of things that are applicable across borders.
Yeah, that's well said. And also a bunch of open questions to answer about how the world's developing. Things are moving fast. Inter-imperialist competition is intensifying. There's new crises. The position, for example, of many European countries is changing rapidly as the kind of economic stagnation continues. There's a lot to discuss and debate. And these debates between communist parties, fraternal debates, historically has been in communist organizations incredibly enriching for the international communist movement. So it's great there's a platform like Proletarian Perspectives to help bring organizations together to discuss and debate these things, to really highlight key debates within the international communist movement, and to promote this sort of fraternal discussions and debates. It's really needed. And, we've seen even in recent years, communist organizations and Maoist organizations translating each other's documents, republishing them as a key way, for example, to aid in the struggle against Gonzaloism. And even recently, I was reading some articles from a few different orgs in different countries struggling against Gonzaloism, and saw a clear link between some of their struggles and the struggles we've waged here in the US. I'm sure you've had a similar experience in Denmark, reading something like, oh, yeah, this is very similar to what we're dealing with. And that's just a small piece of the picture. But yet platforms like Proletarian Perspectives are so essential. All right, Karl. Well, it's been so great having you here for this interview. It'd be great to have you and others from the DKU back and sometime soon. And if things really heat up over stuff with Greenland, it'd be great to have a live stream to talk about that and get a quick reaction together to discuss the possible implications or for other topics as well. So thank you again so much for joining.
Thank you very much for having us on. We really appreciate being able to tell a little bit about what's been going on in the old Europe, that Maoism also exists here, and that the movements across the world are advancing, actually. So I would love to be back. I would love to bring other comrades on. And maybe if you guys have a question, you can ask me in the comments for a future appearance, maybe.
Yeah, that would be great. And please post any comments you have for Karl and the DKU in the comments below. They'll be sure to keep a lookout for them. When we have Karl or others back from the DKU, we'll dive into a few of those. So thank you very much, comrade. Revolutionary greetings to you and all the others in Denmark fighting for Maoism and for proletarian revolution.
Al salam. Red salute.
Al salam.